When Elena Rossi stood at the door of the farmhouse where 5 generations of her family had been born, where her great-great-grandfather had laid the foundation stones in 1823, and locked it for what she knew would be the last time in the autumn of 1351, she understood that she was not just leaving a building, but abandoning an entire way of life that her ancestors had built through decades of labor, and which the plague had made impossible to continue. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The farmhouse stood in the hills of Tuscany, about 20 miles south of Florence, in a region of rolling countryside where wheat and olives and grapes had been cultivated since Roman times. The Rossi family had farmed this particular piece of land for more than a century, had watched it change with the seasons year after year, had learned its moods and its needs, had built their identity around the rhythms of planting and harvest and the slow accumulation of small improvements that each generation made to the land and the buildings. Elena was 28 years old, a widow since the previous autumn when the plague had taken her husband Marco, along with both of his parents, his brother, and 2 of his 3 sisters. She'd survived along with Marco's surviving sister Lucia and Lucia's 2 young children. The 4 of them were all that remained of a family that had numbered 14 people. Before the plague arrived in September of 1348, they'd tried to continue farming through the year that followed Marco's death. The fields still needed planting, the olives still needed harvesting, the grapes still needed tending. But 3 women and 2 small children, the children were 5 and 7, too young for real labor, couldn't manage work that had previously required 8 adults and several strong teenagers. They'd planted only the closest fields, had let the more distant ones lie fallow, had harvested what they could, and left much to rot because they simply didn't have the hands or the strength to bring it all in. And the economics had changed fundamentally. Before the plague, the Rossi family had produced enough to feed themselves with surplus to sell at the Florence markets. Income that paid for the things they couldn't produce themselves: tools, cloth, salt, the occasional luxury. But with half the family dead, they had fewer mouths to feed, while also having far less capacity to produce. The mathematics no longer worked. They were working harder than ever and barely managing subsistence, with no surplus, no savings, no cushion against the inevitable bad harvest or unexpected expense that would push them over the edge into complete destitution. Lucia had been the first to say what they'd both been thinking: "We can't stay here. We're killing ourselves trying to maintain something that's already gone. We need to leave, to find another situation, something that matches what we're actually capable of doing." Elena had resisted this conclusion for weeks, had argued that they just needed to adapt further, to accept a smaller operation, to find ways to make it work with their reduced numbers. But in her heart she'd known Lucia was right. The farm required a family, a proper family with multiple generations and enough hands to manage the work. 3 women and 2 children couldn't sustain it, couldn't maintain the buildings and the equipment and the land, and still have enough time and energy left to actually produce food. And beyond the practical impossibility, there was the emotional weight of continuing to live in a place so saturated with loss. Every room in the farmhouse held memories of the dead. Marco's chair at the table, his parents' bedroom, the workshop where his brother had repaired tools and equipment, the courtyard where the whole family had gathered on summer evenings. Elena walked through these spaces every day and felt the absence like a physical pressure, like the house itself was haunted not by ghosts, but by the weight of vanished lives, by the impossible task of being only 4 people in a space designed for 14. So they'd made the decision to leave, to abandon the farm and migrate to Florence, where Lucia's husband's brother lived and where he'd written saying there was work available, that the city needed people, that the plague had created opportunities even as it had destroyed so much else. The decision had taken weeks to finalize, had involved endless discussions about practicalities and emotions, and the guilt of leaving behind what their ancestors had built. But finally they'd committed, had begun making preparations, had started the process of ending their life on the land. The preparations had been more complicated and more painful than Elena had anticipated. What do you take when you're leaving forever? What do you leave behind? The house was full of possessions accumulated over generations, furniture that Elena's great-grandmother had brought to the farm when she married, tools that had been used by Elena's grandfather, pots and pans that had cooked thousands of meals, linens that had been woven by women whose names Elena barely remembered, but whose hands had created these everyday objects that had become part of the family's material life. They couldn't take it all. They would be walking to Florence. 20 miles was manageable in a day if you weren't carrying too much, and they needed to limit themselves to what could be reasonably transported. So they'd sorted through everything, making painful decisions about what was essential and what could be abandoned, what had enough sentimental value to justify the burden of carrying it, and what could be left behind for whoever might eventually occupy the farm. Elena had kept relatively little, a few changes of clothing, a small wooden box that had belonged to her mother, containing letters and a few pieces of simple jewelry, a prayer book, a knife that Marco had carried, the one piece of him she could hold and keep. Lucia had been slightly more practical, had focused on things the children would need, on warm clothing and blankets, and the small comforts that might make the transition easier for them. Everything else, all the furniture, all the tools, all the accumulated material culture of 5 generations would stay. Elena had left a note placed prominently on the kitchen table, explaining who they were and that they'd had to leave, that whoever came next was welcome to everything in the house, that she hoped they would care for the land as her family had cared for it. She didn't know if anyone would ever read the note, if anyone would come to this farm, but writing it had felt important, had felt like a proper ending, like a way of passing the responsibility forward, even though she had no idea who might receive it. Now, standing at the door with her small bundle of possessions, with Lucia and the children waiting in the courtyard, Elena took a final look at the house's interior. The morning light came through the kitchen window at the angle she'd seen thousands of times, illuminating the worn stones of the floor, the hearth where fires had burned every winter for more than a century, the table where her family had eaten their meals and made their plans and lived their daily lives. She thought about all the people who'd stood in this kitchen, who'd looked at this same light coming through this same window, who'd felt connected to this place in the same deep way she felt connected to it. Her great-great-grandfather who'd built the house, her great-grandmother who'd kept the garden, her grandfather who'd planted the olive grove, her father who'd expanded the vineyard, Marco who'd loved her here, who'd planned their future here, who'd believed they would raise their children here and grow old here, and be buried in the small family cemetery on the hill above the house. All of that was finished now. The line was broken. The Rossi family would no longer farm this land, would no longer pass it from parent to child, would no longer define themselves by their connection to these particular hills and fields and buildings. They were becoming something else, migrants, displaced people, urban poor probably, though they didn't yet know exactly what their situation in Florence would be. Elena closed the door and locked it, though the lock seemed almost ceremonial. Anyone who wanted to enter could easily break in, and eventually someone probably would. But locking it felt right, felt like a formal ending, like the acknowledgement that she was no longer the mistress of this house, no longer the one responsible for it, no longer the inheritor of the tradition that had sustained her family for so long. She turned to where Lucia waited with the children, little Giovanni, and his younger sister Maria, both somber and bewildered by the changes happening around them, both too young to fully understand that they were leaving their home forever, that they would never again play in these courtyards or sleep in their familiar beds, or wake to the sounds of the farm they'd known since birth. "Ready?" Lucia asked, her voice carefully neutral, not wanting to influence whatever Elena might be feeling at this moment. "No," Elena said honestly, "but it doesn't matter if I'm ready. We're going." They walked together down the path that led from the farmhouse to the road. Elena had walked this path thousands of times to the fields, to the village, to church on Sundays. But now each step felt weighted with finality, with the knowledge that she would never walk this path again, that this particular way of moving through the world was ending, that after today she would be someone different, something different, no longer a farmer connected to land, but a migrant seeking a new life in an unfamiliar city. At the end of the path where it met the road, Elena stopped and turned back to look at the farmhouse one final time. From this distance it looked peaceful, settled, like it had been there forever and would remain forever. The morning sun illuminated the stone walls, the red tile roof, the olive trees that surrounded it. It looked like home, like the place where she belonged, like something permanent in a world that had proven to be far more fragile and temporary than anyone had understood. "Goodbye," she said quietly, speaking to the house, to the land, to her ancestors, to Marco and all the dead who were buried on the hill, to the life she'd thought she would live. "Goodbye." Then she turned away and began walking toward Florence, toward whatever future awaited her there, carrying everything she had left in the world in a bundle on her back and the accumulated grief of the past year in her heart. The walk to Florence took most of the day. The road was busy with other travelers, which surprised Elena. She'd expected it to be relatively empty, but instead there seemed to be constant traffic in both directions. Some people were clearly merchants or traders, traveling on business that had probably continued through the plague and its aftermath. But many others looked like what Elena's group was, families or fragments of families, carrying their possessions, looking displaced and uncertain, moving towards cities and away from the countryside. Lucia noticed this too. "Look at them all," she said quietly, pitching her voice so the children walking ahead wouldn't hear. "We're not the only ones leaving the land. Everyone's moving." It was true. The plague had created a massive disruption in the settled patterns of life, and one consequence was migration on a scale Elena had never witnessed. People were leaving farms that they couldn't maintain, were seeking work in cities where labor shortages had created demand, were moving to places where family connections might provide support, were simply fleeing places too saturated with loss and trauma to remain bearable. Elena fell into conversation with another group traveling the same direction, an elderly man named Giuseppe, who'd been a farmer near Siena, and who was traveling with his granddaughter and her children. His story was similar to Elena's. Most of his family dead, the farm unmaintainable with the survivors. The decision to leave and seek another situation in Florence, where his granddaughter's husband, who'd survived, worked as a carpenter and had said he could find housing for them. "I never thought I'd leave," Giuseppe said as they walked together. "I'm 73 years old. I've lived in the same house, farmed the same land, for my entire life. My father farmed it before me, and his father before him. It seemed permanent, like something that would last forever, that my grandchildren would inherit, and their children after them. But the plague changed all that. In 6 months, it destroyed what took generations to build." Elena understood this completely. It was exactly what she'd been feeling, exactly the loss she was processing, not just the deaths of specific people, but the destruction of continuity, the breaking of the chain that connected past to future, the sudden transformation of something that had seemed permanent into something temporary, finished, abandoned. "What will you do in Florence?" Elena asked. Giuseppe shrugged. "Survive. Help with the grandchildren. Try to be useful. I'm too old to start a new trade, but maybe I can contribute something. And at least I'll be with family, what's left of it. That matters more now than holding on to land that can't be worked." They walked in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, each processing the strange experience of being displaced, of being migrants after having been settled people, of moving toward an uncertain future after having spent their lives in places where futures had seemed relatively predictable. As they walked, Elena observed the landscape they were passing through. Fields that should have been cultivated lay empty. Farmhouses stood abandoned, their windows broken, their doors hanging open, their courtyards overgrown with weeds. In some places she could see evidence that squatters had moved into these empty houses, washing hanging to dry, smoke from chimneys, the general sense of occupation. But many buildings were simply empty, monuments to the families that had left or died, to the agricultural system that had collapsed, to the fundamental reorganization of labor and land that the plague had forced. This wasn't unique to Tuscany, Elena knew. Reports from across Europe described similar patterns: rural depopulation, urban migration, the abandonment of marginal lands, the consolidation of survivors into more concentrated settlements. The plague had killed perhaps a third of Europe's population, and the consequences were still unfolding in ways that no one fully understood. The social and economic order of the medieval world was being transformed. Old patterns were dissolving, and no one knew what would replace them. By late afternoon, Florence came into view. The city sat in the Arno Valley, its distinctive skyline dominated by the tower of the Palazzo Vecchio and the massive dome of the cathedral that was still under construction. Even from a distance, Florence looked prosperous, substantial, permanent, a sharp contrast to the abandoned farmhouses and empty fields they'd been walking past all day. As they approached the city gates, the traffic increased. People were streaming in and out, merchants with loaded carts, peasants bringing produce to market, travelers like themselves seeking entry for various reasons. The guards at the gate were perfunctory, barely glancing at Elena and her group, waving them through without questions. In normal times, city authorities would have been more careful about who they admitted, would have checked for suspicious characters or obvious disease. But these were not normal times, and cities like Florence needed people, needed workers to replace those who died, needed population to maintain their economic vitality. Inside the walls, Florence was overwhelming. Elena had been to the city perhaps a dozen times in her life, for major market days, for important religious festivals, once for a wedding. But she'd always come as a visitor, as someone from outside who would look around with interest, and then return to the countryside where she belonged. Now she was here as a resident, as someone seeking to make a life in this dense, noisy, complicated urban environment. The streets were narrow and crowded, tall buildings looming on either side, blocking the sky except for thin slices visible between the roof lines. The noise was constant and cacophonous, people talking and shouting, carts rattling over cobblestones, animals being driven to market, craftsmen hammering and sawing, merchants calling out their wares. The smells were intense food cooking, waste in the gutters, animal dung, smoke from countless fires, the press of too many human bodies in too small a space. Giovanni and Maria clung to their mother, clearly frightened by the sensory assault, and Elena felt disoriented as well, overwhelmed by the sheer density of everything, the way the city seemed to press in from all sides. How did people live like this? How did they bear the noise and the crowding, and the complete absence of open sky and growing things? But she pushed down her anxiety and focused on the practical task at hand. They needed to find Lucia's brother-in-law, needed to establish where they would stay, needed to figure out their immediate situation. Lucia had an address written on a scrap of paper that she clutched carefully, and they asked directions from passers-by until they found the right neighborhood, working-class area near the Arno, where carpenters and other craftsmen had their workshops and homes. Lucia's brother-in-law, Antonio, was a man in his 40s, a master carpenter with his own shop. He greeted them warmly, but with a distracted air that suggested he was busy, and their arrival, while expected, was just one more complication in an already complicated life. He showed them to a small room above his workshop, barely large enough for the four of them to sleep in, with no furnishings beyond a few straw mattresses and a single stool, and explained that this was what he could offer for now, that housing in Florence was expensive and space was limited, that they'd need to find work quickly to contribute to their own support. "The city needs people," Antonio said, echoing what Elena had heard from others. "Half the workshops are short-handed. Servants are impossible to find. Laborers are demanding wages that would have been unthinkable before the plague. If you're willing to work, you can survive here, but it won't be easy, and it won't be what you're used to." That night, lying on an uncomfortable straw mattress in the stuffy room above the workshop, listening to the city noises that never quite ceased even after dark, Elena felt the full weight of what she'd done, what she'd left behind. The farmhouse had been quiet at night except for natural sounds, wind in the trees, animals moving in the darkness, the occasional owl. Here there were voices and footsteps and carts, and the constant low roar of a city that never truly slept. She missed the farm with a physical ache, missed the familiar spaces and sounds and smells, missed the sense of knowing where she was and who she was, missed the identity that had been rooted in land and family and tradition. Here she was no one, knew nothing, had no place or purpose beyond simple survival. The grief for what she'd lost mixed with fear about what came next, and she lay awake for hours, eventually hearing the bells marking the night hours from various churches across the city, counting them, and marveling that she was close enough to hear so many different bells, that she was in a place dense enough to have multiple churches within earshot. The next morning, Elena and Lucia began the process of finding work. Antonio had suggested they start at the textile workshops, which were always looking for workers and which required skills that women could learn relatively quickly. Florence's economy was built on wool and silk production, with elaborate workshops that processed raw materials into finished cloth that was exported across Europe. The plague had devastated these workshops' labor forces, and they were desperate for workers. Elena and Lucia were hired almost immediately at a wool workshop in the Santa Cruz neighborhood, put to work carding and combing wool, preparing it for the spinners and weavers who would transform it into cloth. The work was tedious and physically demanding, standing for long hours repeating the same motions, breathing the wool dust that hung in the air, working at a pace that was determined not by natural rhythms of day and season, but by the foreman's demands and the workshop's production goals. It was so different from farm work that Elena struggled to adjust. On the farm, work had varied with the seasons and the weather, had involved movement across landscapes, had included a mix of tasks that changed throughout the day and year. Here, it was the same thing hour after hour, day after day, inside a dim workshop that seemed designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum comfort or dignity. But the wages were real more than Elena had ever earned on the farm, where income had been irregular and mostly in kind rather than coin. Here she received actual money at the end of each week, coins she could hold and count, that represented her labor in a tangible way that farm work never had. The wages were modest, but with both her and Lucia working, they could afford to pay Antonio for their housing and food and still have a small amount left over for other necessities. Gradually, over the following weeks, Elena began to adjust to urban life. The initial overwhelming sensory assault faded as she became accustomed to the noise and crowding and smells. She learned to navigate the city's streets, developed a mental map of the neighborhoods between their housing and the workshop and the market where they bought food. She learned the rhythms of the city, the morning bells that called the faithful to early mass, the market hours, the times when traffic was heaviest, and when streets were relatively passable, the evening curfew when the city gates closed and residents were expected to be indoors. The workshop itself became familiar. The other workers became known individuals rather than just anonymous presences. The tedious labor became routine rather than novel and exhausting. Elena found herself settling into this new life, not because she loved it or because it felt like where she belonged, but simply because humans adapt, because familiar patterns develop even in unfamiliar circumstances, because life insists on continuing even when the form it takes is nothing like what was expected or desired. She made a few friends among the other workshop women, women with stories similar to her own displaced by the plague, having lost families and farms and previous lives, now working for wages in an urban environment that was strange but at least offered the possibility of survival. One woman named Francesca had been widowed like Elena, had left a farm in the countryside north of Florence, had been working at the workshop for nearly a year, and had developed a pragmatic philosophy about their situation. "It's not what I wanted," Francesca said one afternoon as they worked side by side, their hands moving through the wool in the practiced motions that were becoming automatic. "I miss the farm, miss the freedom of it, miss working outside and seeing seasons change. But this is what I have now. I'm alive, I'm earning wages, I'm not starving. That's more than a lot of people can say. You learn to accept it, to find what satisfaction you can in small things, to build a life even when it's not the life you'd planned. Elena understood this, found it helpful to hear someone else articulate what she'd been feeling, but hadn't quite been able to express. Acceptance wasn't the same as happiness, but it was something, it was a way forward. It was a realistic response to circumstances that couldn't be changed. As autumn moved toward winter, Florence's patterns became Elena's patterns. She rose early, walked to the workshop, worked until the day's labor was finished, walked back to Antonio's building, ate whatever simple meal they could afford, slept in the cramped room above the workshop. On Sundays she attended Mass at Santa Croce, the great Franciscan church in their neighborhood, standing in the crowd of workers and merchants and poor people who filled the nave, listening to the Latin liturgy that was familiar even when everything else was strange. The children adjusted better than Elena had expected. Giovanni and Maria, after initial bewilderment, seemed to take the move as a kind of adventure, found new playmates among the neighborhood children, learned to navigate the city streets with the confidence of the young. Lucia had worried they would be traumatized by the displacement, by the loss of everything familiar. But children were resilient, built new attachments quickly, lived more in the present than adults did. Within a few months, Giovanni and Maria seemed like city children, seemed to have always lived here, seemed to have integrated the transition in ways that the adults couldn't quite manage. Winter in Florence was cold and damp, the narrow streets channeling wind and rain in ways that made the weather feel worse than it probably was. The room above Antonio's workshop was drafty and inadequate, and they spent miserable nights huddled under thin blankets, never quite warm enough, always slightly damp. Elena longed for the farmhouse with its solid walls and its hearth that had kept the whole building warm, for the security of having stores of food and fuel that would last the winter, for the self-sufficiency that farm life had provided. But they survived. They worked, they earned wages, they bought food and fuel, they endured the cold and the discomfort. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Florence began to feel less foreign, began to feel like a place where Elena could imagine living not just temporarily, but long-term, began to feel like it might eventually become something like home, even if it would never be home in the way the farm had been. In January, Elena had an unexpected encounter that shifted something in her understanding of her situation. She was at the market, buying vegetables for the week, when she ran into someone she recognized, Father Pietro, the priest from her village church, the man who'd baptized her and married her to Marco and conducted Marco's funeral when he died of plague. Father Pietro looked older and more worn than Elena remembered, but his face lit up with recognition when he saw her. They embraced, and Elena felt a rush of emotion, this connection to her previous life, this person who'd known her before, who could see both who she'd been and who she was becoming. Elena, I'd heard rumors that some from our region had come to Florence, but I didn't know if you were among them. How are you? Are you surviving? Surviving, yes, Elena said. Working at a wool workshop, living in a room above a carpenter's shop. It's not what I'd imagined, but it's life. What brings you to Florence? Father Pietro's expression grew somber. The village is nearly empty now. After the plague, perhaps 40 people remained, and over the past year most of them have left as you did. The church stands, but there's barely a congregation. The bishop reassigned me here to Santa Croce, where they needed priests after losing so many to plague. I'm still adjusting to urban ministry, still learning to serve people whose lives are so different from what I knew in the countryside. They talked for perhaps half an hour, standing in the market amid the bustle of buying and selling, sharing their experiences of migration and adjustment, of leaving behind familiar places and trying to build lives in this strange, dense city. Father Pietro told Elena that he'd met several other refugees from their region, that there was a kind of informal community of displaced people who gathered occasionally at Santa Croce, who maintained connections to their origins even as they adapted to their new circumstances. "You should come," he said. "This Sunday after Mass, there's a group of us, perhaps 20 people, from various villages in our area. We share news, we remember together, we support each other. It might help to be with people who understand where you've come from." Elena agreed to come, and that Sunday she met the group Father Pietro had described. They gathered in a side chapel of Santa Croce after the main Mass had ended, sitting on benches and talking quietly, sharing their stories of leaving the land and adjusting to urban life. The stories were all variations on the same themes: families destroyed by plague, farms abandoned because they couldn't be maintained with reduced labor, migration to cities where work was available, the ongoing struggle to adapt to urban conditions while mourning what had been lost. But there was also something affirming about the gathering, something that helped Elena feel less alone in her displacement. These people understood what she'd experienced in ways that Francesca and her other workshop friends couldn't quite grasp, because these people had lived the same life she'd lived, had lost the same kind of life she'd lost, had made the same painful decision to leave the land and seek survival elsewhere. One man, a former farmer named Carlo, articulated what several people seemed to be feeling. "We're the ones who left," he said. "We're the ones who abandoned the land our ancestors farmed, who broke the chain, who decided that survival mattered more than tradition. Some people might judge us for that, might say we should have stayed no matter what, should have maintained what our families built even if it killed us. But we chose life over land, chose adaptation over tradition, and maybe that's what our ancestors would have wanted. Maybe the real tradition isn't staying in one place, but doing what's necessary to survive, to continue, to pass something forward, even if it's not exactly what we inherited." Elena found this perspective helpful, found it eased some of the guilt she'd been carrying about leaving the farm. She'd felt like she was betraying her ancestors, abandoning a responsibility she should have maintained regardless of cost. But maybe Carlo was right. Maybe the choice to leave was itself a form of faithfulness, a recognition that people mattered more than places, that survival and adaptation were themselves traditions worth honoring. The group began meeting regularly every Sunday after Mass, a gathering of displaced people who supported each other, shared practical advice about urban living, maintained connections to their rural origins while adapting to their new circumstances. The meetings became important to Elena, gave her a community beyond the workshop, gave her people who understood her losses and her struggles in ways that eased the isolation she'd been feeling. As winter moved toward spring, Elena's life in Florence became more established. The workshop labor remained tedious, but she'd grown accustomed to it, had developed the muscle memory and the psychological defenses that made it bearable. The room above Antonio's workshop remained cramped and uncomfortable, but she'd gotten used to that too, had accepted that urban housing for working people was never going to match the space and comfort of a farmhouse. And she'd begun to build a social life beyond just the basic requirements of work and survival. The Sunday gatherings with the displaced farmers group, occasional evenings with Francesca and other workshop women, the rhythms of the city that she was learning to navigate, and even, in small ways, to appreciate the market days with their variety and abundance, the religious festivals with their pageantry and music, the sense that she was part of something larger than herself, part of a living urban community that was complex and dynamic in ways that small rural villages never were. But she never stopped missing the farm. The city was interesting, even exciting in its way, offered opportunities and experiences that rural life didn't. But it also felt fundamentally unnatural to Elena, felt like a space where humans lived in ways that were disconnected from the earth and the seasons and the fundamental realities of where food came from and how life sustained itself. In the city, everything was mediated food, came from markets where it had already been processed and packaged. Water came from fountains fed by aqueducts. Waste was somehow disposed of, though Elena didn't quite understand how. The direct connection between human labor and survival that had been so obvious on the farm was obscured in the city, hidden behind layers of economic exchange and social organization. She thought about this disconnect one spring afternoon, standing at the workshop and moving wool through her hands, in the same repetitive motion she'd performed thousands of times. This wool had come from sheep. She knew that, but she had no connection to those sheep, no knowledge of where they'd been raised or who'd tended them. The wool arrived at the workshop as a commodity, already transformed from a living product into an economic one, and her labor further transformed it into cloth that would be sold to people she'd never meet, who would wear it without any connection to or knowledge of the hands that had processed it. On the farm, such disconnection would have been impossible. When Elena tended sheep, when she sheared their wool and processed it and wove it into cloth, she knew the sheep as individuals, knew the land they grazed, knew the full chain from living animal to finished product. The work had had an integrity, a completeness, that urban workshop labor completely lacked. But this nostalgia didn't change the basic fact that she couldn't return to the farm, that life was finished for her, that her future lay in the city, whether she liked it or not. So she continued working, continued adapting, continued building whatever life was possible within the circumstances she hadn't chosen but had to accept. In April, news reached Florence of developments in the countryside that affected the abandoned farms. The Florentine government, recognizing that vast amounts of agricultural land was sitting unused because of population loss, had begun offering incentives for people to resettle rural areas. They were reducing taxes for farmers who would take over abandoned land. We're offering seed grain and tools to help new farmers get established. We're basically trying to reverse the urban migration that the plague had triggered. When Elena heard this news at the Sunday gathering, her first thought was whether she should go back, whether this was an opportunity to reclaim what she'd lost. If the government was offering support, maybe it would be possible to farm again, to return to the land even without the full family that had once been necessary to make it work. Maybe she and Lucia and the children could manage if they had governmental support, if they weren't expected to maintain the entire operation that the Rossi family had built, but could work on a smaller scale, more appropriate to their actual numbers. But as she thought about it more carefully, she realized she didn't want to go back, even if it was now practical. She'd spent 6 months adapting to urban life, had built connections and routines, had begun to integrate into the city in ways that would be difficult to reverse. And more fundamentally, the farm held too many painful memories, too much loss, too much grief. Going back would mean being surrounded by ghosts, by the constant reminders of everyone who died and everything that had been destroyed. It would be better, she decided, to leave the farm to someone else, to let new people make new lives there, to let the place be transformed by different people with different histories who could farm that land without carrying the weight of loss that would have crushed Elena if she'd tried to return. She shared this decision with the Sunday group, and several others expressed similar feelings. Yes, theoretically, they could return to the land, but the trauma of loss, the difficulty of being in places so saturated with painful memories, the social connections they'd built in the city, all of these factors made staying in Florence seem like the better choice, even though farm life had in many ways been preferable to the conditions they now endured. "We're becoming city people," Francesca observed. "Not because we love the city, but because we can't bear the countryside anymore, because the places we came from are too full of ghosts. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed places, made them uninhabitable for survivors, even though the land itself remains viable. That's another kind of loss, another kind of displacement." As spring advanced, Elena began to think about her future in more active terms, not just adapting to circumstances, but making choices, planning, exercising some agency over the direction of her life. She'd been in survival mode since Marco's death, had been reacting to crises and making emergency decisions, and simply trying to get through each day. But almost a year and a half had passed since the plague had first struck the farm, and Elena was still alive, was functional, was capable of more than just survival. She began to consider remarriage. She was 28, still young enough to have children, still capable of building a family if she could find an appropriate partner. The idea felt both disloyal to Marco and pragmatically necessary. She'd loved Marco, would always loved Marco in some sense, but he was dead, had been dead for more than a year, and Elena was alive and needed to make a life that acknowledged that reality. Urban Florence was full of widowers and surviving single men, the plague having created an enormous surplus of potential partners for women in Elena's situation. Several men at the workshop or in the neighborhood had expressed interest in her, and Elena had been deflecting their attention, not ready to consider such possibilities. But maybe it was time to reconsider, to think about whether one of these men might be a viable partner, whether she could build something with someone, even though it would never be what she'd had with Marco. She raised this topic tentatively with Lucia one evening, not wanting to appear to be abandoning their shared household or prioritizing her own needs over their collective survival. But Lucia was immediately supportive. "You should remarry, Elena. You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. I know you loved Marco, we all loved Marco, but he's gone and you can't spend the rest of your life mourning him. If you can find someone decent, someone who'll treat you well, you should take that opportunity. What about you?" Elena asked. "Would you consider remarrying?" Lucia was quiet for a moment, considering. "Maybe eventually, but I have the children to think about, and I don't know if I'm ready to bring a stepfather into their lives. You don't have that complication. You're free to make choices just for yourself." Over the following weeks, Elena allowed herself to be more receptive to the men who'd expressed interest. One in particular seemed promising, a widower named Tommaso, who worked as a leather worker, who'd lost his wife and children to plague, who was looking to rebuild his life just as Elena was. They began meeting occasionally, conversations after Mass or brief encounters at the market, feeling each other out, trying to determine if they might be compatible. Tommaso was not Marco. He was older, nearly 40 quieter, less immediately warm. But he was solid and reliable, seemed genuinely kind, was clearly lonely, and seeking companionship as much as Elena was. After several weeks of these tentative interactions, he proposed marriage, not romantically, but practically, laying out the mutual benefits, acknowledging that this would be a partnership born of necessity more than passion, but suggesting that such partnerships could still be valuable, could still provide stability and companionship, and the possibility of building something together. Elena accepted, not because she loved Tommaso, but because the proposal made sense, because remarriage would provide security and the possibility of children and a household of her own, rather than continued dependence on Antonio's charity. They married in May of 1352, 2 years after the plague had first struck Elena's farm, in a simple ceremony at Santa Croce, witnessed by Lucia and the children and a few friends from the workshop and the Sunday gathering. The marriage was workable rather than passionate. Tommaso was a good man, treated Elena with respect and consideration, worked hard at his leather trade, and brought home steady wages. They established a household in a small apartment near his workshop, 2 rooms that felt spacious compared to the cramped space above. Antonio's shop, but which still felt confining compared to the farmhouse Elena had left behind. She became pregnant within a few months, gave birth to a daughter in the spring of 1353. They named her Chiara, and Elena felt a complicated mixture of emotions looking at this baby joy, at new life, grief that Marco wasn't there to meet his wife's child by another man, hope that this baby represented a future rather than just a continuation of loss. Life settled into new patterns. Elena continued working at the workshop until the late stages of her pregnancy, and then returned, a few months after Chiara was born, needing the wages, finding that she missed the social interaction and the sense of purpose that work provided, even when the work itself was tedious. Tommaso's mother, who'd survived the plague and who lived nearby, helped care for Chiara during the day, and Elena would return home to nurse and care for the baby in the evenings. It was a life, a functioning life, built from the fragments of what had been destroyed. It wasn't what Elena had imagined when she was young, wasn't the life she'd had with Marco on the farm, but it was real and it was hers, and she'd made it through choices and adaptations and the determination to survive and create, meaning despite catastrophic loss. The Sunday gatherings continued, the group of displaced farmers meeting after Mass to share their ongoing experiences of urban adaptation. But the nature of the gathering was changing as time passed. Some people, like Elena, were remarrying and building new families. Others were finding success in urban trades, accumulating some wealth, moving into better housing. A few had actually returned to the countryside, taking advantage of the government incentives, trying to rebuild rural lives even with the ghosts. And the younger people in the group, the children who'd been displaced by the plague, were growing up as city people, were losing connection to rural origins that they barely remembered. We're becoming integrated into urban life in ways their parents never quite would. Elena watched Giovanni and Maria, Lucia's children, who were now 10 and 12, and who seemed fully at home in Florence, who talked about the city as if it was where they'd always lived, who showed no interest in or nostalgia for the farm they'd left. This was how cultural change happened, Elena realized, not through dramatic transformations, but through the gradual forgetting of younger generations, through children who grew up in new circumstances, and for whom those circumstances became normal, became just the way things were rather than a painful departure from the way things should be. As Kiara grew from infant to toddler to young child, Elena found herself torn between two impulses. Part of her wanted to tell Kiara about the farm, about the Rossi family's history, about the land that 5 generations had cultivated and which had been abandoned only under the pressure of catastrophic circumstances. She wanted Kiara to know where she came from, to understand that her mother hadn't always been an urban worker, but had been a farmer, had had a completely different life before the plague had destroyed it. But another part of her hesitated to burden Kiara with this history, hesitated to make the child carry the weight of a past she hadn't experienced and a loss she couldn't understand. Maybe it was better to let Kiara be simply a city child, a leather worker's daughter, someone whose identity was rooted in Florence, and who wouldn't be haunted by the knowledge of an alternative life that had been lost before she was born. Elena never fully resolved this tension, ended up telling Kiara some things about the farm but not everything, sharing some memories but not dwelling on them, acknowledging the past but not making it the center of family identity. It was a compromise like so much else in the life she'd built, a way of honoring both what had been and what was, of holding together the person she'd been and the person she'd become. The years passed. Kiara grew, and Elena and Tommaso had another child, a son they named Marco in honor of Elena's first husband, a gesture that Tommaso supported even though it meant his son bore another man's name. The workshop continued, the leather business continued, the city continued, the life continued. Elena aged from her 20s into her 30s, and then her 40s, her hands growing rough from labor, her face showing the marks of years and grief and hard work and survival. The Rossi farmhouse, she learned eventually through indirect news, had been reoccupied by a family from another region, refugees from somewhere else who'd taken advantage of the government incentives to resettle abandoned land. They'd moved into the house Elena had locked and left, had used the furniture and tools she'd abandoned, had planted the fields and tended the olives, and made their own lives in a place that had once defined Elena's identity, but which now belonged to someone else, somewhere else, some other story. Elena felt surprisingly little about this news when she heard it. The farm had already become distant in her mind, had already transformed from a real place where she'd lived into a kind of myth, a story she told herself about who she'd once been. The physical reality of it, the fact that real people were now living there and working the land, didn't change the myth, didn't affect the role the farm played in Elena's understanding of herself. She was a migrant, a displaced person, someone who'd left the land behind not because she'd wanted to, but because circumstances had forced her to choose between land and life, and she'd chosen life. That choice defined her, had shaped everything that came after, had made her who she was in ways that were both painful and, she was coming to understand, valuable. Because the experience of migration, of displacement, of having to adapt to completely new circumstances, had taught Elena things she wouldn't have learned if she'd stayed safely on the farm. It had taught her resilience, had taught her that identity wasn't fixed, but could be rebuilt, had taught her that humans were capable of surviving and even thriving in conditions they'd never imagined, had taught her that home wasn't necessarily a place, but could be a practice, a set of relationships, a way of being in the world that could be portable, even when physical locations were lost. These weren't lessons she'd wanted to learn. She would have preferred to live her entire life on the Rossi farm, to pass it to her children, to die and be buried on the hill with her ancestors and Marco. But that hadn't been possible, and the lessons she'd learned from its impossibility had value even though the circumstances that had taught them had been catastrophic. In her 50s, Elena began to think about legacy, about what she would leave behind when she died. She'd kept very little from the farm, just the wooden box her mother had given her, Marco's knife, a few other small items. But she had memories, and she had stories, and she had the knowledge of what it meant to leave land behind, to migrate, to rebuild. She began writing these things down, slowly and laboriously, because reading and writing hadn't been part of her farm education, and she'd only learned the basics since coming to Florence. But she wanted to record what she remembered of the farm, of her family, of the life that had been lost. She wanted Chiara and Marco and any grandchildren to know where she'd come from, to understand that their urban life was built on rural foundations, that their grandmother had lived a completely different life before circumstances had forced her to migrate. The writing was difficult, not just because of the technical challenges, but because it required her to revisit memories and losses that she'd learned to manage by not dwelling on them. She cried while writing about Marco's death, about leaving the farmhouse, about locking the door for the last time. But she continued, driven by the sense that these stories mattered, that the experience of a generation needed to be preserved, especially if it was a generation defined by catastrophe and loss and forced migration. When she finished, she had perhaps 50 pages, a document that mixed factual family history with personal memories and reflections on what it meant to leave land behind. She gave copies to her children and to Father Pietro, who'd maintained his ministry at Santa Croce, and who'd become a repository of stories from the displaced farmers who'd migrated to Florence. She asked Father Pietro to keep her document with others like it, to maintain an archive that might help future generations understand what the plague years had been like, what had been lost, what it had cost to survive. Father Pietro accepted this responsibility, told Elena that hers wasn't the only such document he'd received, that several others from the displaced farmers group had written similar memoirs, that together they were creating an accidental archive that documented the plague's aftermath from the perspective of rural people who'd been forced off the land. "This matters," Father Pietro said, holding Elena's manuscript carefully. "Not just for your family, but for everyone who comes after. The plague was catastrophic, but the story doesn't end with the death toll. The story continues with people like you, who survived and adapted and rebuilt and created new lives from the ruins. That story deserves to be told and preserved.